Good morning. I'm going to go through a blog that I've just been working up, the title of which is "To Whom Are We Indebted? Who Extracts the Death Pledge? Feudalism versus Wage Slavery Serfs Up." This guy here has written a book and he's referred to in this introductory paragraph here. In the world of housing, it seems like the rich keep getting richer while the working class is left struggling to make ends meet. But what if I told you that it's all part of a plan? Yep, you heard me right. The housing crisis is not a design flaw, it's a design feature. And it's time for us to wake up and smell the coffee. According to Ricardo Tranjan's book, The Tenant Class, the housing market is working exactly as it's designed to do. It's a system that benefits the wealthy at the expense of the tenant class. But fear not, my fellow precariats. Tranjan suggests that by organising and building political power, we can break this paradigm and take back control. But how did we get here in the first place? Well, it all comes down to the debt-based money system. Banks have the power to create money out of thin air, which allows for wealth transfer from the bottom half of society to the top. It's a trickle up process that has been going on for decades. So who do we owe the money to exactly? It's a great question. It got discussed at the end of the global financial crisis #1. At that point, Royal Bank of Scotland was bailed out and was in public hands for a while, and it was suggested at that time by the Sturdy blog and others, including myself, that instead of building up its value, that's RBS's value, and then selling it back to shareholders, why not turn it into a publicly owned institution that provides loans and ethical banking services to ordinary people? Now it's time for us to have an alternative that actually works for the benefit of wider society, for what used to be called civil society, rather than just for the oligarchs or the the corporate ruling class, as it were. So let's, as part of that thought experiment, then think about Lloyds Bank and their wholly owned subsidiary, which has been going for about 2 years now, Sintra Living. It seems like a huge conflict of interest that a joint stock or clearing bank, which Lloyds is, which is also the largest mortgage lender in the UK housing market, has now set up a wholly owned subsidiary staffed by Lloyds members, which is now aiming to become the largest landlord in the UK. They've just signed up to buy 600 homes off Barratt Homes. They've got a similar deal with Gleeson Homes. Now, it's time for a proper forensic investigation of how that works in the Lloyds balance sheet. Banks have the power to create money by creating deposits, and if they do it for their own benefit, then they have the benefit of first use of newly created money at the same time as they dilute existing value, not just money that's held by people, but assets which are valued with reference to the monetary unit. It's a very serious problem, and it will facilitate the acceleration of this trickle up. And so this is part of the same insight that Ricardo Trajan's had in his book. I think Trajan's absolutely right. So what if there is no crisis at all, no housing crisis? What if it's just a way for the rich to get richer and to lock in their control and their ruling position without reference to any democratic oversight? This is a hypothesis. It's not new. It was explored by the economist Evsey Domar, who argued that enslaving or inserfing a person makes sense if the wage you have to pay for that worker to be nominally free in wage slavery, if that wage, with him being free, is substantially above the cost of feeding and housing and clothing that man in slavery or serfdom, it's just an economic choice which the owning class, the ruling class, the slave owning class will actually, that's just a calculation which they will casually do. And I actually contend that that's precisely what the World Economic Forum means when it says you will own nothing and be happy. You'll be a happy, obedient slave. So let's stop pretending that this is about prudent stewardship of public finances and start acknowledging that it's about political economy. Now, Vickers is another historian who showed in his work on farmers and fishermen in Essex County that the development of the New England economy was built on nominally free but largely unfree labour, because the workers were not held in check by slavery but by onerous burdens of debt. And so going on now through this blog, I'm going to just put some flesh on the bones of what those statements are backed up by empirically, by facts. So it's time for us to take action to demand change. The WF reminded us all through the Event 101 pandemic that, you know, we will own nothing and be happy. The Great Reset will redeem us of our consuming sins, our climate sins. So I got a better idea about how we can be happier. Let's build a system that works for all of us, not just for the power-hungry, paranoid, psychopathic few. That's really what my message is listen, guys, if you don't want to be a serf, you better hear you better smell the coffee, as we said at the beginning of this introduction. So To Whom Do We Owe This Money Exactly appeared in something called the Sturdy blog in April the 8th, 2011. And the writer of the Sturdy blog is Alex, I forget his surname, who tells us in that blog that he used to work for the guy that wrote the Vickers report into banking at all the time that the inquiries into banking were going on and why the banks had failed in the global financial crisis. That blog had this was just the introductory paragraph, the link to it on the Wayback Machine, because it disappeared off the Sturdy blog, which also has all the comments intact if you click the blue on this thing. But this is what Alex wrote. I've followed the political debate about austerity programs of cuts relatively closely over the last few months. I've been witness to countless television and radio debates in which the importance of our credit rating status so that we may borrow money on better terms is repeated with military drummer regularity, in which any possible criticism of the assault currently underway on public services is met with lachrymose alacrity by three words: our national debt. Now, that sort of sets up this blog, which poses these questions. And then the answer to that question is then put up in another blog, which appeared on this one here. The answer to whom to owe this money exactly, which I think was on the 14th, a little later. First responses to the April the 8th blog was from Bill Cruz, and Bill Cruz has two excellent articles on Economania, which is the Mensa Society economics blog, and there's a link where money comes from in the first place. Now, this isn't on the front page of that blog anymore, but it is on the Wayback Machine, and I cut and pasted it from there. And I'm just going to go through some of the points here which I've been highlighting. I turned the resolution down on this screen because this computer I work on where I am in Wales isn't that powerful, so I can't. It's so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it back into draft because it's more easily readable. So it's a better resolution now, better for me to read it. So what I'm going to do is just read the highlighted bits. You can read the whole thing. So where money comes from in the first place, apart from the few percent that's minted or printed, banks make it up. It's as simple as that. Don't believe me, read on. These are the words of Bill Cruz. So here's the President of America on the subject in a speech at Georgetown University in April 14th, 2009. Obama said, although there are a lot of Americans who understandably think that government money would be better spent going directly to families and businesses instead of banks, where's our bailout? They ask, the truth is that $1 of capital in a bank can actually result in $8 or $10 of loans to families and businesses, a multiplier effect that can ultimately lead to a faster pace of economic growth. Well, I mean, Obama is a liar, a crook, and is up to his neck in the problems that we find ourselves in. He's part of the problem, not part of the solution. That's my opinion. But nonetheless, he's referring to the fractional reserve theory of banking there. Now, there are some quotes from some much more honest politicians coming up. There are plenty from American politicians if you dig into the history and the literature on this stuff. But let's just read these highlighted bits. So banks do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is accept promissory notes in exchange for credits to the borrower's transaction accounts. Right. So that's an important point. It's a point which Richard Werner makes on the Renegade Economist interview, the quite famous one where the guy from the Telegraph, his jaw hits the floor. But anyway, let's just go. So the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas quote, banks actually create money when they lend it. Okay. Then this is an older quote from a book. So it's from Reginald McKenna, the former British Chancellor of the Exchequer. While banks have this power of creating money, it will be found that they exercise it only within the strict limits of sound banking policy. That was then. This is now. We're coming on to Lloyds Bank and Centra Homes. So he then goes on to say, I'm afraid the ordinary citizen will not like to be told that the banks or the Bank of England can create or destroy money. We are in the habit of thinking of money as wealth, as indeed it is in the hands of the individual who owns it. Perhaps we should say who earns it, wealth in the most liquid form. And we do not like to hear that some private institution can create it at pleasure. It conjures up a picture of an autocratic and irresponsible body, which by some black art of its own contriving can increase or diminish wealth, and presumably make a great deal of profit in the process. Indeed. Another quote, Edmund Conway wrote, capitalist societies chose some decades ago to have a fractional reserve banking system. This is what Obama's referring to, where banks lend out more cash than they have in their vaults, because this helps people provide money for companies and households to invest. There it is in print in a mainstream UK newspaper, right? So these are partial understandings of the whole process. And as we work through this blog, and if you read this blog in full and take the Going Direct monetary quiz, you'll have a better understanding of quite how this system now works against the interest of virtually everybody, every business, every person in the UK. Going Direct is designed by BlackRock and the World Economic Forum for the monopoly cartel of trans-global corporations. They do not create wealth. They're a parasite upon the wealth-creating body of society. And the sooner we have another Sherman Act to break up the trusts, antitrust legislation, which was eroded, the banking legislation, which was got rid of. I'm referring to the Glass-Steagall Act. The net effect of that process has been the impoverishment of just about everybody else, and just the centralizing of power in the political bodies that want. So I'm talking about the North American Union, I'm talking about the European Union. These supranational political groupings and the supranational corporate groupings are working hand in glove in state monopoly capitalism, and that is the definition of fascism of both Mussolini and Roosevelt. So here's the Bank of England on the subject. Banks extend credit by simply increasing the borrowing customer's current account, which can be paid away to wherever the borrower wants by the bank, writing a check on itself. That is, banks extend credit by creating money. Should they be able to do it to form their own wholly owned subsidiaries, buying assets off people? It's passing fraudulent money if you're doing that. You are Lloyds are defrauding the Barrett shareholders effectively by saying, look, we'll give you this money in return for these houses that you've built and paid for. But where's that money from Lloyds coming from? If they're extending credit to themselves and increasing their deposits, they're actually getting those places for free and cheating out possibly one of their own customers who could get a mortgage to buy that very property. It's outrageous if you think about it. It's absolutely outrageous. So let's go on further. So the Vickers Commission here in 2011 on page 65. Fifth, even before the crisis, banks enjoyed various kinds of state support, including the effective right to create money. On page 98, like narrow banking, a complete move from fractional to full reserve banking would drastically curtail the lending capacity of the UK banking system, reducing the amount of credit available to households and businesses and destroying intermediation synergies. To its proponents, this shrinkage of credit is a benefit as it removes the current ability of banks to create money, a prerogative they consider should be reserved for the state. Okay. the state is used in a very broad sense there. I support that, but not in the sense of the state just usurping the, going from one tyrannical corporate body to a tyrannical corporate state. They effectively merged anyway, so the need is for that process to be separated out and to get the proper oversight. Now, this is a quote from Sir Richard Body in the House of Commons in 1999, and this part here I found quite striking. If one looks at some of the other figures, one sees that the proportion of debt-free money in circulation is in steady decline. Some 30 years ago, it was 17%, and it has been dropping ever since. So some 30 years ago, that's in that's 99, so that's at the end of the 1960s. Right, we now have what I might call a 3% chancellor, because only 3% of our money stock now is directly in his hands. So this is talking about seigniorage on notes and coins in circulation, which the banks have to buy off the government, and the bank gets something called seigniorage, which is the profit of the face value of a note and what it costs to produce, and it costs a lot less to produce paper money. Funnily enough, copper coins cost more than the face value to produce, but large denomination banknotes are great for the government because they get the profit. It's called the seigniorage. But on all the digital money, all that seigniorage goes to the private banks. So where are we? So one cannot go below 1%. I beg the Honourable Lady to bear in mind what will happen almost in the lifetime of this Parliament if we do not put on our thinking caps and consider how we will cope with the decline in debt-free money. Now, the total extinguishment of debt-free money is central bank digital currencies. If central banks and the large systemically important global banks roll out central bank digital currencies, there will be no cash. There will be no effective democracy. Well, there isn't anyway, but in theory there could be. But it's the end of freedom. The end of cash is the end of freedom. End of. So Sir Richard Body goes on to say the issue of gilts and bills is inflationary because they are used as a deposit by the banks to enable them to re-lend, often by a multiple of 10. Now, an expansion of the money supply, the reason that happens is because the interest element is on loans isn't created, and therefore if the monetary supply isn't expanding, it will actually implode. And so the fractional reserve understanding of money doesn't get you home on understanding how inflation of the money supply and inflation as a measure and an excuse for putting up interest rates, for instance, you won't understand why effectively they're two sides of the same coin, as it were. Right, so Bill Cruz goes on to quote this guy here, Richard Stokes MP, in a 1944 debate where he's trying to ask Sir John Anderson, who was the Chancellor Exchequer, will the Chancellor explain why it's preferable in the national interest to create new money with interest rather than create new money without? Okay, and then they had this back and forth where the Chancellor just doesn't want to answer that question. And no doubt the Remembrancer gave him a nice big slap on the back afterwards. Here's another question from Piers Loftus, who was another MP. So the creation of credit by the banks. Right, the technique of inflation. This is the point here. So I asked the Chancellor of Exchequer to study that remarkable article which appeared in The Economist last November under the heading "The Technique of Inflation." Whatever we do, we must not follow the same technique as in the last war. the creation of credit by the banks, the lending of those credits to customers, the customers buying war bonds and depositing those war bonds as a basis for loans for more war bonds. This had a kind of snowball effect and left a vast burden of debt to the nation. The Economist, which is the most orthodox paper, suggested that a new technique was necessary by which government should borrow any inflationary money, any credit created for the purpose, direct from the joint stock banks, paying a charge to cover their overhead costs, bookkeeping, etc. The charge mentioned by the Economist was 0.5%. Now, if that comes from the banks and the banks charge a fair rate for it, they're performing a service and performing banking services as opposed to performing extortion services for their own benefit. I've mentioned the Rentenmark in a couple of other blogs I've done recently on the Going Direct Paradigm blog. I don't want to get too deeply into how that works and how to decouple positive interest rates and lending money into an economy from being inflationary. Richard Werner goes into it as well. There's more than one way to skin this cat. But what this blog is showing and what Bill Cruz is showing is that these are questions that have been grappled with. There's a quote coming up actually, which I quite like here, but let's just do the thing. So, I've always deprecated foolish attacks on the banks, and anything I say is not in criticism of the management of the banks, but of the system. For I have never concealed my opinion that the system whereby most of our money, and 3/4 of our money is check money, it's more than that now, is created by companies and not by the state, is a wrong system, and that it is responsible for many evils. I'm convinced that under our privately controlled issue of money, money that is burdened with interest from the moment of its creation, we shall never be able in peacetime to develop fully our agriculture and industry, and we shall be able to do so in wartime only at the cost of piling up vast burdens of debt. I think that's true. If you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, it was, we need to be on a war footing. It's as if we're at war and all the rest of it. And boy, did they bung up the debt, and now we're paying. It's craziness. This is insanity. The only explanation for it are megalomaniacs like Klaus Schwab, like Larry Fink, who want to control the world, like Bill Gates. And these people, they're not bright, they're not clever, they're not smart. What they are is they're deeply disturbed individuals who are megalomaniacs. And, just say no to megalomaniacs. They're not good for anyone. They're even a danger to themselves. And it goes on. I urge the Chancellor to do what ought to have been done long ago, and that is that the Crown should resume the essential right of every state, the right given away by William III in return for the throne, to control the issue and cancellation of every kind of money. Now, this is what I was referring to Rishi Sunak and the new Whig junto. The Whig junto enabled William III and got the Dutch system of banking into the UK. So this is what's being mentioned here. I know that many will say that these words are merely the mutterings of a currency crank, and that I shall be accused of being a green shirt and a follower of Major Douglas. I never have been, although I have admired greatly his diagnosis, without agreeing with the remedies he proposes. My reply is that I have learned these ideas as a result of taking the advice of Lord Baldwin, who told us to study the work of Benjamin Disraeli. I followed his advice, and I now quote the words which he used. Disraeli wrote that King William III introduced into England the system of Dutch finance. The principle that system was to mortgage industry to protect property. This system has made debt a national habit. It has made credit the ruling power, not the exceptional auxiliary of all transactions. Disraeli described the results of this system in typical Disraelian florid rhetoric: a mortgaged aristocracy, a gambling foreign commerce, a home trade founded on a morbid competition, and a degraded people. I mean, that does sum it all up. Competing for a scarce monetary unit rather than providing the required liquidity to maximize production to meet the needs and wants of people in society, otherwise known as perpetuating artificial scarcity and making money valuable and goods less valuable, i.e. deflation. So it might be objected that Disraeli wrote these words before he had the experience of office. I will quote in reply the words of one who was Chancellor of the Exchequer more times than any other man in history, Mr. Gladstone. He said, "From the time I took office as Chancellor, I began to learn that the state held, in the face of the Bank and City, an essentially false position as to finance. The government itself was not to be a power in matters of finance, but was to leave the money power supreme and unquestioned." These are voices from the long distant past, but I would call in the voice of one of the greatest living liberals, Senor Madariaga, who at one time was president of the League of Nations. He said, "These great financial institutions have attained two aims. They have all but evicted the state from its position as the only dispenser of money. They have all but evicted the industrialist from his position as manager and controller of industry. The absorption of all powers by the dispensers of credit is one of the most fantastic phenomena of modern life." Wake up, people. Then hear another quote. May I then quote from the recent writings of Pope Pius XI, who in an encyclical said, "It is patent that in our days not wealth alone is accumulated, but immense power and despotic domination are concentrated in the hands of a few, who for the most part are not the owners, but only the trustees and directors of invested funds, which they administer at their own good pleasure. This domination is most powerfully exercised by those who, because they hold and control money, also govern credit and determine its allotment, for that reason supplying the lifeblood to the entire economic body and grasping in their hands, as it were, the very soul of production, so that no one can breathe against their will." Goodness me. Finally, I make this appeal not only to my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Are you listening, Jeremy Hunt? You junto junkie, but to every member of this committee and every member of this House. There are multitudes in this country and throughout the world of men and women who realised before this war that the whole modern system of finance was breaking down. So before this pandemic, that the whole modern system of finance was breaking down, that it had failed to solve in any country the unemployment problem, that it had destroyed vast stores of food desired by the people, and that the system stood condemned. But they regarded with horror the alternatives offered to them by the disciples of either Karl Marx or Adolf Hitler. Well, you know, you can pick your green fascists on one side, or you can pick your World Economic Forum, or all the same, corporate fascists on the other side. The degradation of man to the level of the hive or herd, the revival of slavery of mind and body, destructive to the soul of man. They look for and believe in a better order, and many of them look to this country for a lead. I believe that these multitudes have their own vague ideal of what the future should be. They desire a varied society of free men, where the productive resources are used to the utmost and where consumption keeps pace with productive power. They desire individual liberty to be maintained, and they desire every encouragement of legitimate private enterprise. They also wish freedom of choice in the market, and that international trade should no longer be a savage struggle to obtain favourable balances, but rather an equal exchange of goods to the mutual advantage of all nations. These people look to Britain now to give a lead, and I pray God that they do not look in vain. Right, now, those are the words of Piers Loftus in 1944. So that's coming to the end of the Second World War. But here we are again. here we are again. And what has changed? Nothing's changed. It has got worse. So this is the answer to who we owe this money exactly. So this is back to the Sturdy blog. It goes on about how many people read the blog. The fact it was such a popular blog and it's no longer on the Sturdy blog, or wasn't for a while. I've got this off the Wayback Machine. Go figure. So then this amusing story. Okay, so where are we? So if this business model did not have government support, it would be called a pyramid scheme and outlawed. Okay. So a consistent response has been this tale and variants thereof. Right. So it's a slow day in a damp little Irish town. The rain is beating down and the streets are deserted. Times are tough, everybody's in debt and everybody lives on credit. On this particular day, a rich German tourist is driving through the town. He looks at the local hotel and lays €100 note on the desk, telling the hotel owner he wants to inspect the rooms upstairs in order to pick one to spend the night. The owner gives him some keys, and as soon as the visitors walked upstairs, the hotelier grabs the €100 note and runs next door to pay his debt to the butcher. The butcher takes the €100 note and runs down the street to repay his debt to the pig farmer. The pig farmer takes the €100 note and heads off to pay his bill at the supplier of feed and fuel. The guy at the farmer's co-op takes the €100 note and runs to pay his drinks bill at the pub. The publican slips the money along to the local prostitute drinking at the bar, who has also been facing hard times and has had to offer him services on credit. The hooker then rushes to the hotel and pays off her room bill to the hotel owner with the €100 note. The hotel proprietor then places the €100 note back on the counter so the rich traveller will not suspect anything. At that moment, the traveller comes down the stairs, picks up the €100 note, states that the rooms are not satisfactory, pockets the money and leaves town. No one produced anything, no one earned anything. However, the whole town is now out of debt and looking to the future with a lot more optimism. This story is a superb way of describing the matter in a simple way, but contains two fundamental misconceptions. First, it assumes interest-free debt. The reality is that the hotelier, butcher, farmer, publican and prostitute only managed to pay a small part of their debt, most of their repayment being interest. Second, it assumes no intermediaries. What if each transaction were handled by the town's banker, who skims €10 each time for his services? Okay, well, that's a fair enough point, but the idea of velocity of money and that money is a flow, and so as with all of these systems with several variables, they get quite complicated quite quickly. It is a good story, as indeed is Bernard Letier's parable of the 11th round. He goes on to mention working for Sir John Vickers at the Office of Fair Trading. This is the guy that wrote this blog. And then he makes the point about RBS should be kept in public ownership to do effectively all that's being recommended up here in these quotes, particularly this quote here from Pierce Loftus. This paragraph here, which I read out. So I responded to that article on the April 12th, 2011. Bill Cruz responded to the first part of that article as well. And then the next thing I've put in here is the banking economics of repossessions, which is actually showing it. If a bank has created the money that your mortgage is made up of, and they haven't actually backed it with anything, if they repossess, they get both your house. You have to write off your deposit or whatever that you put down. And what does the bank actually lose? What happens in that situation? Compare that also to what have Lloyds Bank actually parted with for this subsidiary of theirs to buy 600 houses off Barratt's. They've just made the money up, or may have made the money up. So Economania, Bill Cruz, and so here's the article, which actually is still on the site. This is an old Positive Money video. Cut benefits to bankers, not public services. It's private now. It's not generally available. I've got it on BitChute, and you can also watch it on the Wayback Machine. You can see that was published in 2011. This was at the height of Occupy, at the height of resistance against the bankers' bonuses after the banker bailouts, etc. And so this is where Osborne and Cameron and the coalition government sold out the British SME class and enabled looting. Look at the BuzzFeed article, Dash for Cash. Read Andy Verity's book about the LIBOR rigging and all the rest of it. But there are still unsettled accounts with those fraudulent bankers. In fact, the chief executive of one of the quoted large banks was up to his neck in that criminality. That's both sub judice at the moment and subject to various legal action that's ongoing. But it will come out. In fact, Andrew Verity is well aware of that particular story that I've referenced there. So cut benefits to bankers, not public services, one good cut. Now, Occupy got infiltrated, so did Positive Money, Gatekeepers Foundations, and Democracy Useful Idiot School. So Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor, and promoting this idea of owning nothing and being happy, this green con that's going on. Ursula von der Leyen at the beginning of the pandemic, Event 201, at Davos that year, gave a eulogy almost to dear Klaus Schwab. You should watch it, and this is all part of this general con to concentrate the ownership of everything in the hands of the ruling class, the parasitic class, and we're all supposed to take our soma and be happy if we're in the brave new world, or just suck it up and pretend that that two fingers is four fingers in the great tradition of 1984. Well, let's make 1984 history again, folks. This is an article about a talk that Paul Carlier gave at the Transparency Task Force about the failings of Andrew Bailey when he was at the Financial Conduct Authority. This is the money quiz, which I've renamed the Going Direct quiz because Positive Money have sold out. And then here's my two latest blogs on the dilution of asset wealth in the light of the Citra Living Properties, Lloyds Bank Group equity investments, and Lloyds Banking Group investments in operational companies. And I'm saying it's a massive conflict of interest. The balance sheet treatment of this should be subject to parliamentary inquiry and or a judicial review. And then the blog goes on, and then we end up with the slavery serfdom hypothesis. So this is out of Bradford DeLong's blog in 2003, The Causes of Slavery or Serfdom, a Hypothesis. Paul Krugman's post Serfs Up reminds me of my major sins, this scene for which I must atone. my cutting FC Doma's The Causes of Slavery and Serfdom hypothesis from my spring 2003 economics reading list. Krugman summarizes Domar's main point. Okay, so I'm going to read this now. Domar was motivated by his knowledge of Russian history. Serfdom in Russia, he knew, wasn't an institution that dated back to the Dark Ages. Instead, it was mainly a 16th century creation, contemporaneous with the beginning of the Great Russian expansion into the steppes. Why? He came up with a simple yet powerful insight. There's no point in enslaving or enserfing a man unless the wage you would have to pay him if he was free is substantially above the cost of feeding, housing, and clothing him. Imagine a pre-industrial society where population is pressing on limited land supplies and the marginal product of labour, and hence the real wage rate. I'm not going to... This all makes sense, and it's absolutely spot on. And then this is Bernard Laitier, who was at MIT with Krugman, saying never touch the money system, which all those quotes from the Houses of Common point to that as well. And then finally, we finish up with Farmers and Fishermen, 2 centuries of work in Essex County. Okay, so this is Vickers. It was mentioned in the bar scene in Good Will Hunting, which is actually my favourite film. Will Hunting is talking to some preppy sort of first year know-it-all. And he says, "Oh yeah, you got that from Vickers, page 98, etc." But anyway, so Vickers was well known to historians throughout the States. His award-winning 1994 book, Farmers and Fishermen, 2 Centuries of Work in Essex County, had delineated through painstaking analysis of archival records of entire communities the extent to which the development of New England had depended on labour that was largely unfree, with workers held in check not by slavery but by onerous burdens of debt. Hailed as one of the best works yet written on the early American economy, and as a book that explained the deepest inner workings of New England society and of today's society, I would add. And then here's a bunch of blogs of Own Nothing, Be Happy on the Grub Street Journal blog. So I'm going to end there. And as I say, Lloyd's and their subsidiary, it needs looking at. It's part of a wider power grab, wealth transfer that's been ongoing for many years, and just as Ricardo Tranjan is saying here, you know, they can't get away with it if we just say no. So just say no. Just say no to the state-endorsed Ponzi scheme. Just say no. Say no to central bank digital currencies. You know, that's what needs to be happening here. You know, say yes to cash. Say no to central bank digital currencies.